Hi, Gerhard Bloom, once again looking at the tyranny and the delusions of the social justice movement. So, have you heard of the rape crisis in Europe? And yes, there is a rape crisis in Europe, but if you're like most people, you're probably largely unaware of it unless you're living in the midst of it in Europe. Because the media, politicians have been stifling it, silencing it, and ignoring it for years. Why? Because this rape crisis is without question being driven by young, recent immigrant Muslims. And that is a fact, however unpleasant that might seem. And yes, there's all sorts of wonderful, decent Muslim immigrants, but this rape crisis is driven overwhelmingly by recent Muslim immigrants. Why? That's an easy one. In Islam, women are second-class citizens. They're considered the properties of their families. The father before they're married and their husbands thereafter. And if they leave the home unchaperoned, without covering themselves up in whatever manner is deemed appropriate, they will be attacked. That's exactly right. Country after country. And just to take one arbitrary example, you can look at the Rotherham scandal in Britain. For nearly a decade, hundreds of young girls were being prostituted out by a gang of Muslim immigrants, and the police knew all about it. They refused to intervene because they didn't want to be stigmatized by this invented label of an Islamophobe. Nonsense. The parents were hysterical and the government did nothing. What finally broke this story was a newspaper. And it is shocking that this was allowed to continue. And you might get offended by this post. I don't care, right? Imagine for a moment what the lives of these people living under this tyranny of Muslim violence, sexual and otherwise, are going through. You're offended by me? What about the gang rapes? Teachers having their heads cut off with a rusty knife for showing a cartoon of Muhammad. You're not offended by that? Do I hate Muslims? No. I've said this before. I have Muslim friends. Their Islam is an Islam deeply informed by a liberal democratic philosophy, whether they recognize this or not. Yes, Muslims can be tolerant, they can be liberal. Islam is neither, and that is a fact. And yes, I've done the research, countless hours actually. It's a sad fact that the vast majority of people suffering from Islam are Muslims, notwithstanding the terror that European women are experiencing from sexual violence. The vast majority of women suffering from brutal oppression and exploitation are Muslim women. And by far, Muslims suffer the most from Islamic terrorism. And yes, there's plenty of Europeans and North Americans who have suffered from Islamic terrorism. It remains the case that the vast majority of victims of Islamic terrorists are Muslim. And they are spreading this violence, the Islam, militant Muslims. Islam is a curse visited upon humanity. And this needs to absolutely be confronted. We need to stop lying about this reality. And of course, leftists silence critics of militant Islam. You get Muslim reformers like Majid Nawaz, who recognizes there's a deep problem within Islam as it's been traditionally understood, and you get leftists shouting him down as though he's some sort of bigot. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's escaped Islam, is an apostate, which means she's renounced Islam. She's under death threat by fellow Muslims and shouted down by stupid leftist ideologues. Yes, Islam is a curse visited upon humanity. Imagine all the sorrow and tyranny the world could have been spared had the Prophet never been born. Think of all the lives and the horrors, the stoning to death, the brutal rampages of conquest, the slavery, the sawing off of limbs, the forcing of women into cloth bags, the killing of gays, the rape and violence against women. It's an absolute horror show, and it's a 1400-year horror show. It still goes on. Why do you think ISIS deems it appropriate to have sex slaves? Because Muhammad had sex slaves. Child marriage in Pakistan and Afghanistan? Because Muhammad had a child married. He married a 6-year-old girl and consummated that marriage, meaning he raped her at the age of 9, a 9-year-old girl. And this is not marriage as anybody could reasonably understand it. This is consigning a child to a life of sexual and domestic slavery. And yes, there are, moderate and earnest reformers. The prospects are extremely bleak for any reform within Islam. Islam forbids reform. That will get you killed. Allegedly, the Quran is universal, eternal, and complete. Doesn't leave the reformer much elbow room, does it? For Muslims, my hope is that they renounce this tyranny and brutality. Pick anything. Pick something else. Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, anything but this cancerous ideology. And I know my Muslim friends may not think I understand Islam. Actually, as it happens, my friends recognize that I understand Islam. I have yet to be accused of a Muslim for misunderstanding or misinterpreting Islam. No, I'm not misunderstanding it at all. The Islam that many, thousands, hundreds of thousands around the world embrace is a very moderate strain of Islam. Muslim communities around the world have had, very moderate strains of Islam. But this is a highly sanitized version. The Islam of the Prophet is a blood-curdling narrative of brutality, torture, slavery, unending. 1400 years worth, as it happens. A religion of peace. Think of the 12 people gunned down at Charlie Hebdo for offending the alleged dignity of Islam, or the Prophet. That's right, for the grave sin of publishing some effing cartoons, 12 people were shot to death in cold blood. And long before those Charlie Hebdo murders, there were riots and killings across the Muslim world as a result of cartoons of Muhammad in a Danish newspaper. At least 139 people were killed. Killing for cartoons. Imagine that, if you will. Now contrast the reception in the Muslim world for some ridiculous actually some of them are quite funny, those cartoons, check them out. Some of them are quite entertaining. But contrast that to the work of Andres Serrano and his Piss Christ. It's exactly as offensive as it sounds. It's a photograph of a crucifix with the body of Christ immersed in a jar of urine. Yes, pointy-headed liberals while sipping white wine were clapping and guffawing at how challenging and confronting this all is. They wouldn't think for a moment of doing the same with the Quran because they know that would get them killed. So no mass riots, no mass killings, no calls from the Christian world for the beheading of Serrano. And yes, I get this self-righteous dummies arguing that it's me who's deluded. I'm not deluded. I'm wise to this poisonous nonsense. And please pick up a copy of my book, Deconstructing Social Justice. It's available on Amazon. It's not important because I wrote it. I wrote it because the issues could not be more important. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.